I want to welcome you to the Fall 2019 Texas Economic Forum, co-sponsored by the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom and the Maguire Energy Institute. I'm Meg Tazinski, and I am the Assistant Director of the O'Neill Center and a Research Fellow in the Center. I am very excited for this evening's program. Energy is a topic that is very near and dear to many Texans. This evening's speakers will discuss the changing face of the energy industry and what's on the horizon in the face of recent disruptions. Before briefly introducing our first speaker, I want to go over the format for tonight's program. We have 3 speakers this evening, and each of them will be giving about 10 to 15 minutes worth of remarks, and we will not be taking questions after each presentation. Instead, we're going to hold questions until the end, and we'll invite all 3 speakers back up for a panel-style Q&A session. So at that time, you can direct your questions either to one speaker or to the panel to answer. So we'll leave plenty of time at the end for this Q&A, and then we'll have a reception where we can continue the discussion. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker here. Mike Cox is the founding director of the O'Neill Center and currently an executive in residence with the center. Dr. Cox is formerly chief economist and senior vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, where he served for 25 years advising the president on monetary and other economic policies. Mike will be discussing the challenges and opportunities for energy in the Texas economy. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Before I get started, let me say that if you want some reading material on this, somewhere close around you or outside is this publication, Disruption in the Energy Business, What's Next, okay? That Rick and I wrote. Rick's not here, he's in Tijuana tonight, my co-author. All right, I'm not the main star here. These are the guys who are the stars. I'm just going to tee it up. I'm the person who's really going to stand up here and talk while other people are trying to get in the parking lot, okay? So, but I do want to talk about the headwinds that I see for the opportunities for the energy industry. Not just oil and gas, but also other little ancillary sectors that are still small at this point, and then see what difference it makes for the Texas economy. So by way of outline, I'm going to talk about oil and gas, the problem of abundance, which is low prices, alternatives there. These are the 3 things I see facing the oil and gas industry as it comes up: low prices, continuation of low prices, the alternatives, and then what Bud's going to talk a lot about, harsh public opinion, the haters out there who are coming after oil and gas. And then I'm going to fold it into the Texas economy a little bit here. But I'll be very fast. Well, there was a day not long ago where America imported 60% of the oil that we consumed. That was 2005. Last year, using the annual data, we were down to importing only 12.5% of the oil that we consumed, and we're running at a consumption minus production gap of just 5.7% in 2019. So, ready to export some oil. In fact, we are ready. We're already become, the United States has become the leading global producer of petroleum products, surpassing Russia and Saudi Arabia. We know why this is, of course, it's fracking and so on, but it's Texas that's really leading the way by far. This is a log-based 2 scale, so every tick mark is a doubling, and you can see Texas' huge increase, not only as a share of the United States, but also just the sheer numbers. Texas crude oil production peaked at about 3.5 billion barrels daily in 1972, then began heading down, but thanks to George Mitchell and friends, we're up to 5 million barrels a day now, using a monthly number, the latest monthly number. And it's also true that as a share of U.S. oil production, we're back up to over 40%, which has been a long time since we could support that kind of share of U.S. production. And of course, through the abundance of oil and through legal hurdles that have been overcome, we're able to now export oil. And you've seen U.S. oil exports shoot up over just the past few years. Same thing with natural gas. We export a lot of natural gas via pipeline to Canada and Mexico, but the new thing, of course, is LNG, and you see LNG exports shoot up to places like South Korea, Mexico, Japan, China, and so on. So just when the going gets good, of course, things start to become a little bit rough for the oil patch, namely starting here with prices. Look at the price of oil. These are in inflation-adjusted dollars, 2019 dollars. Oil had its heyday. The black line here had its heyday at nearly $160 a barrel for a short period of time, but riding above 100 for many years now. We're looking at 50s, and natural gas is trying to stay between $2 to $4 per million BTU. So these guys will tell you a lot more about that, but this is the problem of abundance, of course, and low prices. What are the headwinds for oil and gas coming up? Alternatives is another headline. I'm not going to say much about it right here. I'm given very little time, but here are the 50 states in terms of their production of electricity and how they produce it, with the gray bar being natural gas, then coal, and nuclear is green, and then light blue is wind, and everything else is on top, which would be solar and so on mainly, and some biofuels. But look, Texas is the #1 producer of electricity by natural gas, #1 in terms of coal, #1 in terms of wind. We've all seen those blades traveling up 45, shooting out to the west, and that's I think we are close to, we're in the top 5, I believe, also on solar photovoltaic, but we are definitely a big energy producing state, not just oil and gas, not just fossil fuels, but other forms of energy as well. Here we are. If you focus on the top 10, you can see what a big energy producer Texas is. The electric power generation, biggest in the country. Now, the plants that came online in the year 2016 produce electricity through various means: natural gas, gray, nuclear, and green here, and then wind onshore and wind offshore, and solar. At that time, the per megawatt hour cost of generating electricity was about, well, between $150 and $400, but up to $400 for solar. But you've seen enormous reductions in the price of generating electricity through solar photovoltaic. And the plants that are coming online, already being built, that are coming online in the year 2023, are seeing huge cost reductions, to the point where now you see solar is competitive, projected to be competitive with natural gas, as is wind onshore. Wind offshore is expensive. Be a long time for that. It's going to be competitive. Of course, there are battery storage problems, and wind doesn't blow all the time. Sun doesn't, of course, but this is becoming a very competitive source. Another natural barrier facing the oil and gas business. So, there's no doubt that there's some headwinds facing oil and gas. Are they really bad how bad are they for the Texas economy? Well, honestly, not that bad. If you look at, because oil and gas, even though it's important, especially if that's your industry, as a share of the Texas economy, it's small compared to the past. This blue line shows you Texas oil field revenues in constant dollars as a share of Texas personal income. Yes, we're deriving $100 billion now in terms of money in numbers from oil field revenues, but as a share of our economy, that's 7.1%. Got as low as 1.1%. And during this entire period, Texas was having very fast rates of growth. Even while the oil and gas business was contracting, we were having fast rates of growth, mainly owing to other sectors that have grown so much. Texas' non-energy economy is 13 times larger today than when oil share peaked in 1948. There's oil field revenues. There's also mining as a share of GDP, which adds into it all the other part of that industry, not just the exploration, but the technology and all the machinery that has to get produced. But those people will become much more lean and mean in their operations, and you can see that as a share of the total revenues, that's where had a lot of producers have to bite the bullet. Oil field mining as a share of GDP in the U.S. and the Texas economy is only running at about 8.25% now, not far above oil field revenues. A lot more lean and mean. The black line here goes across, shows you the Texas growth rate in GDP for a particular year. You'll see the most recent year, for example, that all other sectors other than mining is the height of that blue bar is how fast Texas grew, which I believe is 3.2%. That year it was pulled up by the fast growth of the mining sector. So it was the year before, but the year before that, the mining sector pulled our average way down. You can see how volatile the mining sector is to the Texas economy, but does it really make us bounce a lot? No, not really, because if you look at Texas's growth rate, all this over the entire time period from 2000 to 2018, overall GDP grew at a 2.92% rate. Without oil and gas, it was 2.77%. So it only added 15 basis points to our growth. We have other fast-growing sectors, not just mining. This is fast growth, but it's a small sector relatively. Education is a big sector, professional and business services, healthcare, wholesale trade, construction around here, arts, entertainment, recreation, and food services, or other fast-growing sectors. In fact, if you compare our growth rates in each one of these sectors to the nation's growth rate, Texas from 2000 to 2018 grew faster than the U.S. in 13 out of 16 major economic sectors. Only the ag sector, the utility sector, and the information sector grew faster at the national level than in Texas. Now, it'd be nice, of course, if we had a strong, given that this is the big future for the U.S. economy, it'd be nice if we had a strong information sector, but we've got other sectors here that are very strong. So, oil and gas, sure, it matters a lot if you're in the industry, and it matters some if you're not, if you're just banking on the Texas economy for its growth and so on, but other things matter too, and matter probably a lot more than oil and gas these days. All right? Thank you.
Invite Bruce Bullock up to the stand. Bruce is the Pat and Jane Bolin Director of the Maguire Energy Institute. Since his arrival in 2007, Mr. Bullock has steered the Institute's programs in energy education, energy policy and economics, and preparing students for careers in energy. Bruce will be discussing the past, present, and future of disruptions in the energy industry.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and we're going to take just a few minutes to talk about some of the disruptions that are out there, maybe drill down a little bit on what Mike just had to say. But I'm fairly optimistic, and I think throughout these slides you'll see why. And disruption is on its way in the energy industry, whether we like it or not. So we might as well embrace it and figure out the best way to capitalize on it. This industry has a long history of disruptions, starting with the steam engine to the light bulb to today, Tesla's electric cars. This industry has had to deal with disruptions, whether it be political, whether it be technology, whether it be alternatives, really since the dawn of the industry. So it's something that we're used to, and something that we ought to be able to handle. Fundamentally, the energy business is and always has been about risk management. And that includes managing disruptions, because that's part of risk. The fact of the matter is, globally, energy is turning more towards a low-carbon future. The only question is pace. Some people would like to see that occur in 10 years. Others see it occurring in 80 years. So we're talking about a timeline and a process, not necessarily an event. And what does that mean for natural gas? What does that mean for or for oil, renewables? Where the industry stands today, we'll talk about that. But kind of my overwhelming point or on all of this is, who better to address these issues? The fact is, the energy industry is the only one that has the scale, the money, and the expertise to really address all of these questions anyway. And many of that are people in this room. And that's why I'm optimistic about the disruptions. Just looking at, I'm just going to not go through these in detail, but I've got a couple of crystal balls that are out there. BP's crystal ball is one of them, and you can see the different sources of energy in 2017 versus what they're predicting in 2040. And they've got 4 different scenarios there. A evolving transition, which is kind of their base case. A more energy, which is kind of a growth as always. They have a less globalization, given nationalistic tendencies and so forth that we see. And then we have a rapid transition scenario. And the one thing you can see on the bottom is oil. And there's some growth in the more energy scenario, but overall it shows it to be fairly flat. Now keep in mind, that's not such a bad thing, simply because as we begin to see things slowing down a little bit in the Permian, I think the global energy supply, especially on oil, will return to more historic decline rates. Throughout history, the global supply of oil, if you drilled nothing else, would decline at 4 to 6% per year. The last few years, as we've been adding all of these reserves in the Permian Basin, that slowed down to about 2 to 3%. I think it'll return back to normal. So we're still going to have to invest a lot of money, and we're still going to have to drill just to stay even in terms of the consumption out through 2040. Here's EIA's crystal ball, and it's not much different. They've got 4 or 5 different base cases there. Some of them have a net decrease at the end of their scenarios in 2050. All of them tend to show a peak in the future and then demand going down after that. And this is a business where demand at some point usually does equal out to supply. What are some of the disruptors we're talking about? Well, disruptor 1, I think, is globalization of natural gas. And this is a good disruptor for us. It's a lower carbon fuel. It's already displaced or is displacing coal in the United States. The LNG growth that Mike referred to earlier is going to displace coal elsewhere. There will still be coal burned, and there's still coal plants being built in other areas of the world. They'll still be around, but the price of global liquefied natural gas is on its way down, and that's good for its adoption on a global basis. Those prices are converging and decoupling from oil. And so the U.S. stands to benefit quite a bit from that, given the investments that we've made on the Gulf Coast by Cheniere and other companies to export LNGs. That's good for Texas, too. Most of those, the LNG infrastructure was built based upon take-or-pay contracts that were signed a number of years ago. And that gave them the financing to be able to build a lot of those plants. That's not going to be the case going forward. This is a business like natural gas onshore that's becoming commoditized. And the price, and that is why the prices are converging globally to around $6 an MCF in Asia and maybe 4 to 5 in Europe. And here's what that means for the U.S. economy in terms of being able to grow our exports of gas. And you can see the blue wedge up there grows fairly substantially. And that's good for the U.S. and that's good for Texas. And you can also see the pipelines, exports and so forth, and imports from Mexico and Canada. The second disruptor is capital markets. If any of you own or have owned any shares in Permian players or others, you know that personally, as I do. What capital markets are expecting now is fundamentally different than what they wanted in the early parts of this decade. The paradigm's flipped. When I started in this business, and I'm sure many of you, when you started in this business, you grew reserves, you kept debt low, and that increased your stock price. That's not the case anymore. They're looking for value, not volume. Investors are. They want to see free cash flow and a return of and return on capital. They're watching closely environmental, social, and governance performance. I would say that's probably a bigger factor in some of the international companies overseas than maybe it is in the U.S., but sooner or later that'll catch up here in the United States as well. And fundamentally, there are investors who are concerned about climate impacts and how that's going to affect their investments. And there's the 12-month share performance of various sectors of the energy industry here, and you can see it's not pretty. This is a little bit more granular detail about what Mike was talking about, and you can see it's kind of a spaghetti graph, but if you go out here, you've got wind here, solar PV, and gas combined cycle, which are the three cheapest forms of electricity, and how far it's come down. Future power developments that are going in now, likely going to package all three of those together. Some work at some certain parts of the day, solar, wind at night, and then you're going to fill it in with combined cycle gas or peak generation turbines, gas turbines. So that is what that is. Look, here's another picture of what I just talked about. Generation today versus generation in 2040. The biggest winners are renewables and natural gas. What are the Europeans doing right now? I just got back from a conference in London where the Shell CEO spoke, the Total CEO spoke, ENI, every major European integrated was there, plus most of our own Wall Street equity folks from New York. And they have decided to invest fairly significantly down the value chain into the power business. BP's recently acquired LightSource and around 200 million. They have a number of partners in that. They've got a kind of a unique financing scheme on that that provides them a lot of upside without a lot of downside. Total has recently paid $1 billion for a battery maker. And Shell has set as its goal to be the largest power producer in the world. And right now they own 10 merchant power plants in the United States. They're all natural gas plants. But I think they're just getting started. They've bought retail companies in Europe as well. The fact is that renewables right now have a lower cost of capital and less volatile revenues than does fossil fuels. And while their margins are low because they've got a lower cost of capital, their returns are relatively high. Generally, investments provide 6 to 7 times more energy than oil at $60 a barrel. But there are significant impediments to the renewables business as well. Those are storage. Storage is still very expensive. Scale, and where are you going to get the rare earth minerals you need to build all these batteries out. And the fact of the matter is, you even though this is a growing area, you cannot put enough solar panels and enough windmills up around the earth to supply everybody power. You're going to have to use natural gas, and that's good for Texas. Disruptor 4, this is something that you've got to be a real oil nerd to be tracking, but it's out there, and It's a single-use plastic ban. We all use water bottles or things of that nature, and this is getting a lot of attention. And plastics are viewed as a growth area for future oil production. One of the few growth areas that are out there, and that's the petrochemical area. However, we're seeing more and more political pressure to ban single-use plastics. In Europe, 4 states in the U.S. Have bans in place now. They cover various things. I mean, we all have read about the plastic bag bans and where that started, but it's grown from there. I think bottom line, while regulation has clearly affected that, at the end of the day, consumer and shareholder pressure are probably going to drive more of that than regulations are. You say, okay, you haven't talked about electric vehicles yet. Well, I think it's a little too early to tell on electric vehicles. There are the current adoption rates. China is the highest. They're at 3.9%. The EU is at 1.8%. The US is at 2.1%. Now, one country that's not up there is Norway. It's quite high. It's as much as 40%. But the way the subsidies work in Norway is they're almost giving away Teslas up there. So it's a bit of an outlier, and they're not in the EU, so it's not reflected in those figures. What are the pros? People that have electric cars generally like them. They drive nicely, inexpensive to fuel and so forth. And you can look around this campus. There are a number of people that have Teslas and so forth. The fact is, the mainstream manufacturers, the VWs, the Hyundais, the Mercedes-Benz, they're just getting ready to get into this business. Rolling out 2021, 2022, they're going to have a large offering of electric vehicles. And that's when we'll tell where consumers are on this. Because you don't necessarily just have to go buy a Tesla if you want an electric car. What are the cons? Well, the internal combustion engine has a lot of room to grow in terms of efficiency. Mazda's coming out with a new engine. Some of you may have read it, the Skyactiv X. It is a gasoline-powered diesel engine, in effect. And it'll improve gasoline mileage and performance in the neighborhood of 20 to 30%, and it's quite a technological feat. And it also becomes a very low carbon internal combustion engine. So there's a ways to go there. And the fact of the matter is, if you look out to about 2035, 85% of the cars on the road will still be internal combustion engines. Outside the U.S., that is more driven by regulation than anything else. The EU has said by 2040 they want all electric vehicles, and they're kind of chipping away at a local level. Like if you go to Amsterdam now, by 2022 to get into the kind of inner ring within Amsterdam, you have to be able to drive an electric vehicle. Those of you who have been in London, almost every Uber driver in London now has a hybrid. They don't have to pay the congestion tax if you have a hybrid. So there are a lot of incentives that are out there that are kind of driving this market as well. Motto going forward for this industry. I like this one from anybody that's been around any Navy SEALs will know this. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. And for me, I entered this industry in 1982. It has always been uncomfortable. You've never known, you look out more than 5 years to be able to tell exactly what things we're going to look at. It's going to stay like that. I appreciate your time.
All right, thank you, Bruce. We'll hear next from Bernard Weinstein. Bernard Weinstein is Associate Director of the Maguire Energy Institute and an adjunct professor of business economics in the Cox School of Business. From 1989 to 2009, he was director of the Center for Economic Development and Research at the University of North Texas, where he is now an emeritus professor of applied economics. Tonight, he'll be discussing the growing pushback against fossil fuels. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Weinstein.
My presentation is going to be a little different. I'm going to talk about another disruption that the industry is facing, particularly the oil and gas industry, coal industry as well, and that is the pushback against fossil fuels. And this is pushback that is getting stronger by the day. It started with the movement to ban fracking. This is 5 or 6 years ago when we started to see ban fracking movements. We even saw a fracking ban proposed in Denton, Texas, a couple of years ago. But it's gone way beyond banning fracking, although this is the anti-frackers poster child, Governor Cuomo of New York State. New York was the first state to ban hydraulic fracturing, and that's imposed a very terrible economic costs on people, communities along the southern tier of New York State, which is rich in hydrocarbons, but there ain't no fracking going on, although people who live there can look across the river and see lots of activity. There was a recent fracking ban rally in Florida. I didn't know Florida had any onshore hydrocarbons, but I guess they don't want to take any chances. And it's not just here in the United States. There have been a lot of protests against hydraulic fracturing in the United Kingdom. Here's the scoreboard today. There are 3 states that have banned fracking. I'll bet you didn't know that Maryland had a fracking ban. Most people don't know that the western part of Maryland is in the Marcellus, and they've got some pretty nice shale, but they don't have any political clout in western Maryland because most Marylanders live in the eastern part of the state. Oregon is likely to pass a fracking ban. I don't know about Florida. And this isn't a complete list, but these are the countries I was able to find that have passed countrywide fracking bans. And you can see there are quite a few there. And some are actually have a fair amount of potential to produce oil and gas from their shale formations. I think it's fair to say that the ENVIROS have been energized by President Trump's policies. It's gone beyond fracking. Fight the pipelines. It's very, very difficult to get permits, particularly state permits, to build pipelines. Not so much here in Texas, but on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in the Midwest, it's becoming increasingly difficult and more expensive to build pipelines. And I think the ENVIROS believe that if they can stop the pipelines, they can kill the industry. That kind of makes sense. If you can't get product from the wellhead to the refinery to the market, that's one way to kill the industry. Another way to kill the industry is to fight things like export terminals. So you can't build an export terminal on the West Coast to increase our capacity to sell more coal to Asia. There is a proposal to build an LNG terminal in Oregon. That's faced a lot of opposition. So that's not likely to happen. This is the new mantra of the anti-carbon activists, and I'm sure you've heard it. It's keep it in the ground. We don't want to produce it. We don't want to consume it. Bad for the planet. End of story. And that applies not only to coal, but to oil and natural gas. There was a global climate conference in Poland last December. And Big Oil decided that they were going to participate and put on a panel to try to find some common ground where environmentalists and the oil industry could at least have a discussion about the global energy future, and it got absolutely nowhere because it was because of protests who essentially inhibited or prohibited the ability to have a dialogue about sound energy policy and the types of energy futures that Bruce was talking about. And we saw a recent disruption right here in Texas, where some protesters shut down the Houston Ship Channel by dangling over a bridge, just hanging, having fun, but it did cause a fair amount of inconvenience because the ship channel was closed for a couple of days. But it's gone beyond just protesting. It's now outright property destruction. We saw that in the Dakota Access Pipeline situation. This was in North Dakota 2 years ago. There was a lot of property destruction. Now that pipeline has been built, but there was about, I don't know, I saw different estimates, $20 to $30 million worth of damage as a result of activities such as the one depicted here. These two bozos tried to shut down a pipeline in Minnesota, and they invited the press to cover it, and they were promptly arrested. This stuff goes on every day. And now there's this new thing called the Extinction Rebellion, and that's going on right now. The Extinction Rebellion is a protest by climate activists that's occurring all around the world. And Bruce saw some of this when he was in London last week. Now, I'm not sure what these people are supposed to represent, but they were successful in shutting down parts of London, including the tube. Isn't that true? They shut down the tube for a couple of hours. Pretty significant disruption. Here's another picture of the disruption in London. There were disruptions in New York and Washington. You probably read about them in the paper. The Extinction Rebellion protests against climate change have shut down areas of central London. But listen to this, the Royal Shakespeare Company has terminated its sponsorship deal with the company, citing the discomfort of young theater goers. So and then Greta Thunberg, we've all heard about her. Last week there was speculation that she might get the Nobel Prize. She didn't, but she may get it next year. Just some recent headlines. You read stuff like this every day. Michael Bloomberg has committed $500 million to close all U.S. coal plants by 2030 and halt all new natural gas plants. A number of American cities are banning the use of natural gas for home heating. I think 3 or 4 cities in California have passed such bans. A little bit of good news is that a couple of Dakota Access Pipeline protesters are facing federal charges and may spend decades in prison. I doubt that they'll spend decades in prison, but there is a federal law that imposes very severe fines and jail time for people who destroy infrastructure related to the U.S. energy industry. And then there's the Green New Deal, and I'm not going to talk about that. The Green New Deal didn't pass. I mean, the resolution passed in the House. It did not pass in the Senate, but it has set the tone for a lot of the discussions that we're hearing among Democrats, at any rate, in the primary race. So consider this. Who wants to ban fracking among the Democratic candidates? Well, Harris, Sanders, Warren, and Booker have all said outright that if I'm elected, you will have a total ban on hydraulic fracturing. Who wants to severely limit fracking? Well, that's everybody else, pretty much. I got a nice graph here that illustrates that everybody hates the oil and gas industry. Let me see. I mean, in a recent survey, something like 70% of the Americans polled in this survey blame the oil and gas industry being a major contributor to climate change. And anyhow, are we looking at the end of oil, the end of gas too? I certainly hope not. We do see lots of forecasts of peak demand. Bruce showed some charts that suggest that we will reach peak demand for oil at some point in the not-too-distant future, maybe in the mid-2030s. Projections of natural gas demand showed global gas consumption rising at least until the year 2050. So I think that's good news. I guess despite all this disruption, despite all the pushback we're seeing, despite the growing influence of what I call anti-carbon activists, that there is a future for fossil fuels. I think it's mainly going to be natural gas. We'll continue to use oil for petrochemicals. I don't know that there are any ready substitutes for the thousands and thousands of products that are derived from petrochemical feedstocks. But it's going to be a bumpy road, and I think the most worrying thing for me is that so many young people are drinking the Kool-Aid, and they've jumped on this bandwagon that believes the planet is destroying itself, that we've got to get off of fossil fuels immediately, if not sooner. And it's unfortunate that we don't have more reasoned discussion in this country about our energy future. So I'll stop there, and the three of us will be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you to our speakers. We've got some chairs over here, so if you could rejoin us at the front for some Q&A. As a reminder, you can direct your questions to a specific speaker or to the panel as a whole. Because we're filming tonight, if you could wait for our microphones to come to you. So in the back here, Liz and Jonathan each have microphones. So raise your hand, I'll call on you, and wait till a microphone to ask your question. And no really long dissertations before you ask your question, please. So here we go.
I guess for Dr. Weinstein, maybe principally, when will ethanol go away and leave us alone, sir?
You must have read my article in Inside Sources that appeared on Tuesday. Unfortunately, ethanol isn't going to go away because it's all wrapped up in politics, particularly politics in an election year. It's a really bizarre situation. Here's the problem with ethanol. Well, there are lots of problems with ethanol. It's a lousy fuel. It's not nearly as efficient as pure gasoline. But gasoline consumption in the United States today is exactly where it was in 2003. Gasoline demand has flattened. Indeed, it is declining because our vehicles have become so much more fuel efficient. Well, that makes the ethanol farmers unhappy because as the demand for gasoline flattens or goes down, the demand for ethanol goes down. So what the Trump administration is proposing is increasing the ethanol mandate from 15 billion gallons to 16 billion gallons next year, and also making E15 available all over the country all around the year. And so refiners they're going to have to push another $1 billion of ethanol into their gasoline. And it just makes no economic sense. But where are the voters? I mean, farmers, Midwest, ethanol refiners, 40% of the nation's corn production goes into ethanol. So the Trump administration is kowtowing to the ethanol interests, which include both farmers and ethanol refiners, as they're called, or ethanol processors. And then on the other side, you've got the oil industry and you've got the automobile industry. They're not thrilled about it. They're concerned that a lot of older vehicles and maybe even some newer vehicles still under warranty won't behave well with 15% ethanol in the gasoline. But it's unfortunately the nation's probably the longest scam that's ever been perpetrated on the American public is going to continue.
Just to add to that, sorry about that, I think the ethanol mandate will be with us until the Iowa caucuses are no longer the first presidential contest.
Yes, I didn't hear anything about
carbon capture, sequestration. Some of the bigger projects, Chevron, Oxy, even Bill Gates is kind of involved with. And I guess you presume that if it works, you can actually put more carbon into the atmosphere and run fossil fuels longer in a kind of steady state. What's your views on that technology?
I'll go ahead and start and then jump in. There's a lot of money being put into that particular technology, but into the maybe of decarbonizing fossil fuels, shall we say, in general. There's a lot of it being put into coal, obviously. Some of it also being put into natural gas. As you said, the majors, Chevron, Exxon, others are putting money into that. If it's successful, yes, it probably will extend the lives of fossil fuels, but that technology is a ways away in terms of feasibility and economics more than anything else.
Yeah, it's very expensive. And as Bruce said, most of our tax dollars that are going into research, so-called research on carbon sequestration, are focused on coal plants, coal-fired power plants. And there have been a few demonstration projects that just haven't worked. And yet, the DOE keeps putting money into doing research on capturing CO2 from coal plants, even though coal's going away. So we heard a question at a conference we were at a couple of weeks ago. There was a guy there from, what do they call it, DARPA-E. It's kind of, research that's funded, ARPA-E, that the DOE funds in the energy sector. And somebody asked the question, why aren't you putting money into natural gas sequestration? And the answer is pretty much because we do what the White House tells us to do, and that's to focus on coal, because President Trump's going to save the coal industry, even though he isn't. So that's politics. It's like ethanol. It's all about politics. It's not about rational economic energy policy.
This isn't quite about oil and gas, but about 10, 15 years ago, before fracking took over, I believe SMU was working with a $30 million grant on looking into developing thermal energy underground, harvesting it. And I wondered if anyone knows about that, or if that's totally dead because of fracking, or what you gentlemen think about it. Thank you.
Well, first of all, to use geothermal energy, you have to frack. So they're not exclusive. They're, to access geothermal energy underneath the earth, you do have to drill a well and frack to, in fact, access geothermal energy.
Closed down pre-drilled wells that had been shut down in Texas.
That's correct. That's correct. That effort is still ongoing, but from a cost perspective, it still is simply not economic, and it's really been taken out of people's forecasts on that, because it still is somewhat like carbon capture and sequestration. It's just not economic at these points.
Can I make, it's not a comment about that so much, it's an overall comment. So I grew up in the 50s listening to Garner Ted Armstrong and Herbert W. Armstrong talk about the world tomorrow. And it was all gloom and doom. It was pessimist, pessimist, pessimist. Basically the modern version of Thomas Malthus, who was, warned us that the population of the earth was going to grow too fast and we were all going to die from it. Periodic fits of starvation and overpopulation. He warned us of that at the time when the population was 785 million. Yet we've solved all these problems, and we've solved the problem. I remember growing up, what these evangelists, televangelists said was that, look, we're not going to have enough food, we're not going to have natural resources, not going to be enough energy, not going to be enough oil. Oil is like a big glass, you can suck all the oil out and it's gone. And yet there are more energy reserves today than ever, known reserves. We solved a tremendous problem, right? I guarantee the problem of global warming is small compared to that problem. And but it's people are, isn't a visceral response to it right now. Imagine how much money does it take to motivate to get somebody to do something? With a population of the planet of 7.5 billion now, would we each be willing to pay $20, to get rid of, or $25 to get rid of this problem? Of course. Well, that means we can create the world's first trillionaire. It doesn't take that much money to motivate somebody to solve a problem. It takes a lot, and not even $1 billion or even a few million to motivate all the bright minds out there to solve a problem. And as my favorite economist of all time, Joseph Schumpeter, said, one problem after another of the supply of commodities to the masses, or any of these problems, is successfully solved by being brought within the reach of the capitalist methods of production. This is a problem we can solve. The reason we haven't solved it yet is because we haven't found a way of pooling the resources together to say, okay, it's an externality that we all create when we burn fossil fuels. How do we deal with the externality problem in a way that harnesses the money to be able to motivate all the research for it? But yet, even though we haven't, it's still happening. There's solutions coming up from all parts of the globe for global warming. I don't honestly. I mean, it sounds. I'm maybe not the last person, but I'm one of the last persons, of course, who wants with kids, anybody to have to worry about this. Any future generations have to worry about this problem. It's not being irresponsible to talk about it this way. It's just having a faith in markets to solve problems. Markets will solve this problem.
Just to amplify on that, this energy transition, as I said, whether it's 20 years or 100 years, that's going on at the same time where there are 1.5 billion people in the world that don't have electricity. And so we have to, at the same time this transition goes on, we have to find a way to provide inexpensive and reliable electricity to a lot more people around the world.
Actually, we have to find a way to guarantee that we have relatively inexpensive and reliable electricity here in the state of Texas, because this past summer we were really skating on thin ice. We were bumping up against 95, 96% of our generating capacity. And the problem in Texas is it's great. We've deregulated. We all love deregulation. That's why among the large industrialized states, we have the lowest kilowatt hour costs in the nation. But we also have 22% of our installed capacity is wind. And when it gets real hot in the afternoons in July, those windmills out in West Texas aren't turning. So, we got to have backup capacity. But the problem in Texas, and this is a problem in other states as well, how do you incentivize companies to invest in baseload power or in peaking units when there's no guaranteed rate of return? So there is a debate going on that will be continuing in the next couple of years. Do we need to restructure the way we price electricity in the state? Do we need to have what's called a capacity charge in addition to the energy-only charge to guarantee some return on new investments, mainly in natural gas plants? As Bruce said, the future is going to be natural gas and renewables. Maybe nuclear. I mean, if we were smart, we'd recognize that if we want a clean energy future, nuclear has got to be part of the mix. But Comanche Peak down the road here was the last power plant to open in the United States, and that was in 1989 or 1990. So there are lots of challenges. But as Bruce said, it's really about electricity. And we talk about natural gas, that's great, but it's natural gas for electricity. That's what the world wants, is electricity. It's the most convenient way to consume energy, but it takes power to make power. And that basic fact of life is not well understood by the public, by the politicians, by environmentalists, and you can go on and on.
Hello. You had the list of the Democratic presidential candidates up there who want to ban fracking.
Yes.
What can effectively be legislated by, I guess, executive order And what's the likely industry response if that were to be done?
Well, I guess the only thing they could legislate or maybe do by executive order is to ban fracking on public lands. I don't know that the president or Congress could ban fracking in general. So, a lot of it is posturing, but still, it doesn't indicate a very, how should I say, cogent assessment of where our energy comes from today and where it's likely to come from in the future. And that's what concerns me.
If you banned it on federal lands, what would that likely mean for oil and gas prices?
I don't know, probably not much, because there ain't a lot of fracking occurring on federal lands right now.
About a month ago, we took out, or we had the missile attack took out half the Saudi production for a week, and 10% maybe it went up the first day. The back end of the curve actually went down.
Our last question.
Just a quick question that I think, Bruce, you made the comment about renewables and we're kind of showing relative cost and stuff. And renewables have a lower cost of capital than fossils. And so implicit in that, I think, in their returns is the tax incentives that renewables enjoy. How's that factored into the real cost of generating those things?
That's a good question. The figures that we put up there, though, are unsubsidized, levelized cost of electricity. So that takes into account two things. One, it takes the tax benefits out of it. And then number two, it does take into account the variability issue of solar and wind and not being able to run all day. But in terms of the returns, that's correct. The tax benefits will provide an extra 2-3% on top of the normal returns that come from the unsubsidized figures. So the biggest benefit that they have is that renewables have in terms of cost of capital is you can finance most of them with debt as opposed to equity. And cost of debt's lower than cost of equity.
Bruce, when does the production tax credit expire? I thought it was this year or next year.
The wind production tax credit expires this year. The solar, I think, goes to 2023 or 2024.
Well, I'm surprised that we haven't heard more about it, because my prediction is that the Trump administration will support extension of the production tax credit. Again, because where are the windmills? They're mainly in red states.
I would agree with that. And the majors, the Exxons and Shells and others of the world, if the right deal were there, I think they'd endorse they do endorse a carbon tax, but what that would look like, I think there's probably a deal to be had in their minds. So I think that's something else.
Wasn't it 5 years ago, the last time the production tax credit was up for renewable? They cut a deal with the Obama administration to lift the ban on U.S. oil exports.
That's correct.
In exchange for supporting extension of the wind production tax credit. So maybe we'll see something like that.
Well, I know there were other hands up. We have a reception right outside in the common area there, so you're welcome to, I think, bug some of the speakers during that time. If you could join me in thanking our speakers one more time.